City Gardens, Frida Utermalin Carter loved fairy tales and folklore. As she set about creating the garden, she placed gnomes and figurines along the enchanted trail to delight visitors. In the 1940s, Fairyland Caverns and Mother Goose Village were added to showcase even more fairy tales with glowing blacklight dioramas. Over the years, Rock City has intrigued and inspired writers like Cormac McCarthy and Neil Gaiman. We hope you are able to visit soon and see these marvels for yourself and find a little inspiration of your own. Learn more at searockcity.com.
Hello, good afternoon. On behalf of Humanities Tennessee, I want to welcome you to our afternoon session in conversation with Rod Davis and WM Akers. I know you're in for a fun time. We hope you have some questions to ask. I'll have some for them, and just enjoy the conversation that we're going to have about their two books. I'm going to start by introducing to you WM Akers. WM is joining us today. Hey, WM, how are you?
I'm fine. You can call me Will or William.
Will is a novelist, playwright, and game designer. He is the author of the mystery novels Westside and Westside Saints. All right, you beat me to it. The best-selling games Dead Ball, Baseball with Dice and Comrades. I'm quite the baseball fan, and my team is already out. Sorry.
Me too.
Cardinals. A revolutionary RPG, and the curator of the history newsletter Strange Times. Born in Nashville, he spent a lucky 13 years in New York before moving to Philadelphia in 2019. And you can learn more about his work at wmakers.net, which I'm sure we can post up in the chat box as well. So welcome, Will. We're going to come back to Will in just a minute and have him kick off with a reading for us. I'm going to go ahead and, while we're at it, give you a little background on Rod Davis. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you.
Rod is the recipient of the inaugural fiction award of the Penn Southwest Book Awards in 2005 for Karina's Way. Additionally, his Penn Texas Award-winning essay, The Fate of the Texas Writer, is included in 50 Years of the Texas Observer, and his Texas monthly story, Walmarts Across Texas, is inserted in True Stories by David Byrne. Davis has also received numerous awards as a magazine editor and writer. He lives in Texas, and both of their books, both Westside Saints, get it in the camera here, and East Texas West of Hell, can both be bought at Parnassus Books. So thank you both for joining us today. Will, would you like to kick off with a reading?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll be reading today from Westside Saints. My new book came out in May. This is the sequel to the first novel in the series, Westside, which introduces our hero, Gilda Carr, a detective who lives in 1921 Manhattan and specializes in solving tiny mysteries, the little things that keep you up at night, like what's that weird smell? Why is my dog not trusting me anymore? What happened to my keys? That kind of thing. Her Manhattan is not like the one that we know today. It is split down the middle along Broadway. There's this huge fence that runs up the middle of the island. And on the west side of the island, the city is deserted, overgrown, and beset by strange, mysterious shadows and horrors. So in Westside Saints, we pick her up after the events of the first novel, which I will not spoil, but basically which left her having a rotten time. This is her thinking about when she first encountered a street preacher named Enoch Bird, who hired her for a case. The business with the blue ink had started in late November, on what must have been our last tolerably warm day, when Enoch found me on my stoop pelting rocks at pigeons and watching night sweep over Washington Square. He was silent until I asked him to sit down, and then he pointed past the bare trees that filled the park to the clean, pale eastern sky. That blue, he said. You only get it at this hour, when the sun is sinking and the shadows are long and day is just clinging on. It's my favorite color in the world. It's good enough. I have dreams in that color. Dreams of hell, not nightmares. I've had them my whole life. My father used to preach about the blue flames of hell, and I decided I'd like to do a tract in his honor with 3-color printing that shows damnation as only he could paint it. He slid a pile of meticulously printed religious blather, 8 pages long and printed in black, white, and a different shade of blue. And no matter how many different blues you try, none of them hits the mark, I said. How did you know? I know the look, that special brand of misery that comes from trying to make the real world line up with something perfect in your head. And these are the cases, the tiny mysteries that are your specialty? I was wary. This is the type of thing I would usually turn down. It was tiny, sure, but it was also impossible. Enoch had standards. You could tell just by looking at his perfect little tracts, and that was hell in a client. But that fall I needed work in every way a woman can. I'll turn the city upside down until you have the blue you want, I said, as long as you can tell me what's so special about this shade. I chucked another rock, missing the bird badly, and he told me a story about a little boy who grew up in the heart of Lower Manhattan, long before a fence divided East Side from West, the son of a gifted preacher who loved his children, loved his ministry more. Even when we did get Papa to ourselves, we never got to be alone with him, he said, except for one afternoon when he took me to see the carriage parade in Central Park. Afterward, we walked the length of it. I was watching the sun set over the lake when he told me to turn around and look east instead. He died soon after. My whole life, that blue has stayed in my heart. Over the next few months, whenever I had the pep to get out of bed, I stalked Manhattan up and down, sifting through shops for printers, authors, artists, stamp collectors, pen collectors, calligraphers, weavers, forgers, pornographers, and anyone else with an eye for beautiful things. To the Lower West, I brought bits of paper stained with every blue I found, and to all of them, Enoch apologized and shook his head. At last, I found an old woman in an underground shop on the Upper West who promised she could make ink to match any shade and creation, so long as I could provide her with a sample. But of course, that was impossible. In all of New York, there was no paint shard, no fabric scrap, no broken pot or torn dust jacket or dead bug that quite matched the flames burning inside Enoch Bird's head. I didn't mind. The longer he was unsatisfied, the more I would eventually bill him, and the longer I put off finding something else to do with my days.
Am I supposed to read now? I guess.
Yes, we'd love for you to read.
So you just want to see if I was up to something. I think I'll start. I was either going to start at the back or the front, but I think I'll start at the front. Should I tell you about the book first, or are we going to do that later?
Go ahead and share a little bit to lead us into it.
Okay, I didn't write this on the back, somebody else did, but basically this book is a sequel to East of Texas, East of Texas, West of Hell is a sequel to South America. I'm having some trouble positioning myself with the camera. And they take place in the South, both of them. And if I get to do a third, it'll probably take place in the South too, or possibly Texas. Now this one follows Jack Prine, who's the protagonist, and he's an ex-TV journalist who in the first book had moved to New Orleans, where he still lives, and tried to help Elle Meridian, who became they sort of fell in love later on in a trying time, help her find the person that murdered her brother. And now he comes back in this one, her daughter, who she'd had to given up for adoption a long time ago. She hears from her and she's missing and she can't find her. So she wants Jack to help her again. And so he comes out of his kind of la-la land in New Orleans to get back involved again. And that's where East of Texas, West of Hell picks up. And before it's over, he'll travel across the South as far as South Carolina one way and far reaches of Texas the other way. And that's the title. And run through an array of bad people to get there. So I think what I'll do is I'll skip to the end where he has helped with his friends. One of them is called Big Red, who's basically a mafia hit guy, sort of semi-retired. And they found Rose, the daughter, and now they're getting together and trying to figure out what to do next. And Big Red lives near Biloxi, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And Jack is finally going to go. They've solved everything. They've been lying low because a lot of people got killed along the way. They have to maintain low profiles. So June rolled into July, and it just got hotter. Nothing you could do about it. Rain helped. At some point in the South, you just realize it will never be cool again. And there you are, like you get a vote about it. That pretty much sums up how the weeks went. Not at first. At first, I was jumpy as a cat on Tennessee's tin roof. I woke up in the middle of the night twice, packed up my bags, and drove off in case someone was looking for me. First to Memphis for a few days. Second time over to Dauphin Island, where I could stand in the Gulf somewhere that wasn't Biloxi. I heard zero from Elle, which I expected. William phoned the day after I got home to let me know that he delivered the ashes as promised. He said Elle wanted them scattered around in the Atlantic because Rose was a child of the water. Elle and Lenora met him off Hunting Island at dawn. William assured me that they had been more at peace because he had handled it. He said I had done the right thing. Not quite the way Red put it. The phrase hung in my head for the next couple of days. It never found traction. I took to calling Red every so often. He's the ex-mafia guy, Red. First was to make sure the house in Dallas had been cleaned up right, if there'd been any blowback from the militia compound or from uncertain, and just generally whether or not he'd heard anything about anyone looking for us. I bought the Dallas paper several times a week from a bookstore on Magazine and saw one story about finding bodies in burned out buildings in West Texas. It said it looked like a drug deal and the feds and the cops were investigating, but I never saw any follow-ups, though it was probably on the local TV stations. I called to tell Red, and he said Po' Boy had already called and said he'd seen it on a cable channel, but only for one day. Nothing ever about Uncertain or Oak Cliff, probably never would be. Red's hoods at least were good at cleanup. He told me it was a wrap. Unless somebody ratted or talked too much, it would be like it never fucking happened. He said I needed to cut way back on drinking. He said if I couldn't chill, I should probably leave the country for a while. Not Mexico, ever. Somewhere else. China, maybe. Or Japan, since I was into all that weird Asian stuff. He didn't care. He just said I had to get better. After the fourth or fifth time I called, he asked if I wanted him to drive over to the city and talk in person, or if I'd rather come over to his place and stay a few days. He said he was mostly just fishing and lying low, so he didn't need any trouble. I think there was just a hint of a warning, not really a threat, about my passing bouts of paranoia or anxiety or whatever they were. The phrase, "suck it up, buddy," came up more than once, but I didn't go to his house or have him come to mind. Altogether, it took a couple of months for me to drop the weight for what we had done, at least what I had done, or at least put it down. I walked around the town a lot, especially along the river levees, sometimes the corridor or Audubon Park. My only conversations were with strangers I chanced to meet. I was okay for money, and with the insider trading investments, probably always would be if I played it smart. I thought of calling Brick, but didn't. Then one night I did. Her phone was disconnected. If I were a betting man, I'd say she had left the country. And I had bet the farm. After the calming came ennui. I don't know how else to describe it. I would think about Elle and Rose and Ronnie and everything that happened. I never did go overseas like Red had suggested. Whatever I had to let go to get my life back, I had to do in the same terrain in which it had become lost. I think that is the story of the South. It's why people stay or leave and return. But I didn't know if that meant staying in New Orleans. And then she was dead.
Thank you. Excellent readings from both of you. First question for both of you, because location is obviously very important in both of your novels. Tell me a little bit about what are some of the factors? How do the locations play a factor? How do you choose location? I think yours, Will, you even have an alternate universe setting in both of your novels. So talk about that to me. Will, you want to kick off and talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So these two books and the whole sort of Westside alternate reality are very much a product of spending a long time living in New York and really reveling in the fact that it's one of those places like New Orleans where you can walk down the street and you can see kind of the layers of history just like written on the buildings as you pass them. So you'll pass a building that's 120 years old and you see the building next door being torn down to build something brand new, and you can see inside of it, you can see its guts. And it's just such a wonderful place for, like connecting with the history, because anywhere you walk, the more you learn about the history, the more you can feel it. And so I've always sort of relished any type of writing project that lets me take that landscape that I really know and really love and sort of rip it up and like put it back together again. And so when I was working on this book, or Westside, and then the sequel, I just had so much fun with taking that landscape that I know so well, that millions of people know so well, and just like taking it apart and putting it back together as suited my story. I went way in depth just for my own purposes with like making sure that like street address is tracked, and that if she walked somewhere, that I knew exactly like where she was turning left, and like was it a long block or a short block, and can you see the sun from there at that time of day, and just not that any of it comes through in the book, but just because for me it is so much fun to get to like walk these streets and get to spend time there, especially now having moved away. And I'd like to think that it comes through in the book.
Very good. Rod?
Well,
the towns, I was smiling with every one of them. I love all of the towns. I love New York. I love all of the places. And it brings about certain frames of mind when you hear those. Tell us a little bit about what went into your choosing of locations and how does it play a factor?
For me, locations have always been a big part of my life. I for better or worse, was one of those kids that was moved around constantly as a child. And then when I grew up, I kept the habit kind of unconsciously, but I'm interested in it. And I've done a lot of, I've been a travel writer, travel editor too. So I'm interested in locations and what they tell about people that live there and how they can reflect on the characters. So I'm fascinated with the South, and I think it shows how location can influence people and how people also want to escape location. Texas is another one. It's like, my God, you have to practically sign on the dotted line to say you're a Texan and you have to do this and that, and you got to love the Alamo and whatever. But it influences how people think and react and vote. And but I like it as, they talk about what is the importance of scenes. I'm losing the quote in my head right now, but it is a factor along with character, and they influence each other. So I've always been attracted to developing scenes as a part of character development.
Well, I liked how you talked about your research, even making sure that it's a short block or a long block. Talk a little bit about some of the other type of research that you do when you research a historical setting.
So the people have asked me about this before, and I think that they always expect to hear that I spent like several years sort of locked in a library leading up to it. And the fact is that I don't have the attention span or the spare time for that kind of work, although I do love, doing library research when I get a chance. But so most of the research from this book just came up kind of unconsciously. I think that if you write about topics that actually interest you and you're the type of person who reads nonfiction, like, you will accumulate a library of books that are like at least tangentially related to the topic. So by the time I started writing about New York in the 20s, it was already a thing where I already had sort of an idea in my head of the landscape and the characters and the sort of reality of the world. And then to fill it in, I did a lot of newspaper research, just looking at New York Times archives from the early 20s, which are all wonderfully digitized. And if you have a New York Times subscription, you can go and look at like full newspapers, like you're looking at microfilm. And you just like scroll through without getting that microfilm headache that you get when you're turning the knob back and forth. And so that ended up sort of became that got transferred into this newsletter, Strange Times, that I write, which is like a day-by-day look at the 1921 New York Times and all the weird stuff that I find there, because I was finding so much just like crazy and wonderful material. I was like, nearly like 1% of this can go in the book maybe, but it's all stuff that I want to share. And so, when I find a story, like I found one the other week about cats that had been trained by arsonists to go into buildings and start fires for insurance purposes. And I was like, well, I have to that has to go out into the world. People need to know about this. And so that's where Strange Times came from. So the research, for me, if the research is pleasurable, then it'll benefit the book. If the research really feels like work, then it's not going to be any fun. Probably I won't have much fun writing about the topic anyway.
Do you ever look at the old obituaries?
Oh yeah, no,
they're the best.
Oh, they're fascinating, and it's so interesting to see the sorts of people who would get written about, who would get an obit in the 1920s, and just like how they tell those stories, and especially like people. An old man who died in 1920, could have been born in 1840, and so you'll get just like the whole sweep of American history, like there in 2 or 3 paragraphs.
And a lot of times they don't sugar them up either. It's just things in there you don't expect to see sometimes.
Mean old jerk died.
Rod, let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about any special opportunities when you write crime or noir novels. Do they offer any special opportunities for dealing with social issues, from race to religion to class?
Well, I think that's one of the things that drew me to the genre, and which term itself is a problem for me sometimes. I think this is as much literature as anything else, and people like Walter Mosley, James Elroy, I've heard them talk to that quite specifically a few times. But I think noir or crime fiction especially lends itself to this, because generally speaking, the people who are the protagonists are afoul of society in some way or the other. And so it gives you the opportunity, like, what do you want to explore? So I'm drawn to issues involving race and class and injustices and so on. So my characters and plots tend to involve people that are doing horrendous things in some way. They're crooks, they're drug dealers, they're rapists, they're human traffickers, they're out and out racists, all that stuff, which is well represented in the South and in Texas. And so it doesn't give me any shortage of things to write about, or people to confront, or people that I understand because I've lived around them most of my life. And so I think if you can work that into a good story with believable characters and a believable plot, you add something extra to it, and maybe you reach somebody that wouldn't be reached in some other way, to at least stop and say, oh well, yeah, I remember I met somebody like that. I knew somebody like that. And but try not to make them try to make them real understandable people that you can hate for their specific qualities, and then kill them if you need to.
Handy tool there. Let me ask this question, because I think it applies in some ways to both of your writings. What challenges do you find when you write a sequel or a second book that's somehow related? Are there challenges inherent in that?
Go ahead, please. No, go.
For me, it was interesting to approach it, because when you write a book, especially if it's a first book where there's not like an assumption that there's going to be a sequel, if you're doing the character justice, at the end of the first book, the character has had a complete arc, they have changed somehow, they have, hopefully dealt with whatever the problems were that were slowing them down at the start of the story. And so it was interesting coming back to it in book 2 and thinking like, okay, so at the end of book 1, Gilda had moved past this stuff. What other stuff is also there? Like, where is the next story with her? How can we push her character forward and like dig more into who she is without like rehashing old ground? How can we make sure that the transformation that she achieved in the first book is still honored and, is something that like we don't go back on, but, while still like digging into her as a person. And, luckily in real life, people usually have more than one problem. And so there can be more than one story there.
Well, when I did, my first book at New South Books was a regular novel, Karina's Way, and it was kind of a comic tragedy kind of a thing. And but when I did South America, I put Jack Prine,
Right.
a Jack Prine novel, and partly I thought that's what you had to do. And then when East of Texas, when we got to that, I said, I don't want to do that on this one because one, I think of these as separate novels, and if you put part of a series on there, even though it instantly puts it in some kind of category. And I think also a lot of reviewers don't particularly review these books very often. So I wanted to be considered for literary worth as well as, whatever story it told. And I think because my second book, for various reasons, came out, several years after the first one did, it's fair to assume that either no one knew about the first one anymore, had forgotten a lot of things out of it. So you've got to, at least I had to, make sure to make reference early on in the book to what had happened previously. So how this person wound up doing what he's doing, and how these other characters came in, who Rose was, the girl he was looking for, how she related back. And so I found myself at several times also needing to go back and, what do they call it in movies, continuity checks, to make sure, this person didn't just pop up out of nowhere or was dead already or whatever. And but I found that was okay, and that's part of the process. But I like extending the character. As William said, everybody's got more than one problem, and I think there's, I have like thousands, so I think I maybe have 1,000 books in me. But I think I can shape more, and I like writing this style. I do. I've got another novel that I've been working on off and on. That's like more of a literary novel, I think they call them, based on what happened after Katrina in New Orleans and after. And I like doing that too. I enjoyed it. It was different, but I really like these other ones because they force you to write maybe a little tighter all the time, and you have to keep things going, as you know, William, and also make it believable. Nothing bothers me more than to get into let's say some writers whose names I won't mention that have written like their 20th novel of this character. They tend to take a lot of stuff for granted too often. And it's like watching a TV show, it's going to jump the shark when they're just relying on things the characters have already done to explain what they're doing now rather than something else. And I think you probably have to watch for that if you become really successful, which I'd love that trial. Yeah.
Nice problem to have, huh? Well, you touched on it. Let me pick up on one of the things that you were talking about. We were talking about genres, and your work in this series is generally classified into a genre: Southern noir, crime fiction, mystery. How do you really feel about genres in the literary spectrum? And William, I can ask you the same thing. I'm going to kick it off with Rod there because he sort of tiptoed into it.
Yeah, I find that it can be real constraining in a lot of ways. I think its main function must be to tip potential readers off if they're really interested in a certain kind of book. But let's say, especially in the ones that were called crime or mystery or thrillers, and crime in particular, now noir came up, which I kind of like that. It just sounded cooler. I don't know, it just did. But so I call mine Southern noir, but they've even now got rural noir. They'll add an adjective. Thanks, people at Crime Reads. I know you do this. They'll add an adjective to a category of noir, and it's fun. I hope it's playful. But you could have, softball noir come out at some point if enough people were writing about it. And what is that? But what do all these categories do? What do all these genres do? So the people that are in the genres, maybe some don't mind. But I think people who were in it to also be writers,
Yeah.
there's a definite pro and con, because you feel like, are we now like demoted to a subcategory, whereas the literary people up here can get the big reviews and the attention. Maybe some of our works are just as damn good as some of those are, but because they're in a category, and you look, the New York Times, Washington, whatever paper you go to, they'll tend to categorize them that way. And maybe it helps. I don't know, but I do know a lot of writers that have, very mixed feelings. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk so much, William.
I take sort of a different viewpoint, because I always like, when I was younger, I always wanted to be somebody who wrote mystery novels. Like, I wanted to write crime fiction, and that's sort of always been my ambition. And I read some literary fiction. I don't read a lot. When I hear this book is literary fiction, I tend to think, oh, so it's the kind of book where people spend a lot of time like staring out of windows, and thinking about the past. And I actually feel very sort of proud or even honored to be part of a literary tradition where stuff happens, and where people can yell and things explode, and there's foot chases and questions get answered. So it's a category that I'm really proud to belong to, and it also helps that much of my favorite prose that I've ever encountered has been in crime fiction or mystery fiction, and so I'm happy to hang out at that table.
Well, I don't disagree. I maybe I overstated, but I think we're maybe saying the same thing, because I think a lot of the best writing is in these areas, and and that's what it turns out that's what I like. I mean, you go back and read Chandler and some of those the classics. I mean, how can you not like that and think that's very high quality work?
And I also even more than great prose, I prize really excellent storytelling, and in a genre where moving the plot along and keeping it believable and keeping it engaging is such a mechanical and intellectual challenge. I think that when a mystery is really clicking, you will find the best possible storytelling, because otherwise the book doesn't work at all. And I think that's really cool.
Talk to me a little bit about outlining. Will, do you use outlines as you write your books?
Yeah, I'm a really sort of fervent proponent of outlining, and that was actually something that I learned when I was halfway through the first book, Westside, and realized I just had no idea what was going to happen in the second half. Actually, I got to a scene where I wrote a sentence where the main character opened a closet door and found a bomb, and I was like, I don't know why that's there. I don't know who put that there. This is ridiculous. I don't know what's going on in my own story. And so in order to finish that book, I had to write a really detailed outline, and ended up taking the bomb in the closet out because no one put it there. It meant nothing. And so since then, when I'm working on a new project, I will spend quite a long time, sometimes with certain projects as long as a year, off and on, outlining, so that I'm able to really, really, really understand where every piece of the puzzle has to go. I know there are some people who feel working from a really detailed outline is constricting. For me, it's putting up the frame and stretching the canvas, and then I'm able to fill in the canvas. So having the structure established beforehand is what lets me sort of have fun sentence to sentence and moment to moment in the story. So I'm currently working on the third Westside book, Westside Lights, which should come out, I think, in 2022. And I've got like a 20,000 word outline, which is outrageous. I think it's much longer than most people work from. But for me, it's somewhere between an outline and like a really, really lightweight first draft. So it's got dialogue, it's got scene description, and then I'm able to like sort of expand it and fill in. And when I find parts where I'm like, oh, well, this scene that you planned makes no sense at all, throw it out and put in something better. But it makes me a much happier and I think more effective writer.
Very good. Rod, how about you?
Yeah, I use outlines too. And I mean, I started off in journalism and got into magazine writing. And some of those magazine stories can be pretty long. And so you have to make yourself an outline, especially in some of those kinds of things where things have to happen in a certain way and they have to be connected and follow. But it's the same in fiction because I've never written one that extensive, but I have to, and I constantly revise mine because sometimes I've had characters pop up that I didn't plan on being in there before, for example, and you have to deal with that. So you have to maybe revise the outline. I think you said you sometimes do that too. But without it, I think you'd get pretty lost, especially if you're trying to work with the kind of book that has to have both plot and character. I mean, you can't not have one. And sequences are very important. They can, something can happen on page 2 that pops up back again on page 138 for a reason. And you need to have that reason make sense when it comes back as important. And so I find them useful. I can't imagine not doing an outline kind of. So yeah, I think they're very helpful.
Have you read any of the Jan McKeel essays about outlining and structure?
I've read Jan McKeel, but not his essays about outlining. I'll look it up.
Yeah, he wrote a series of, I don't know, maybe eight of them that got published in the New Yorker over the course of a few years, and they got released as a book a few years ago, which I think is called Draft Number 4. It's something like that. Skinny little book. Like all of his work, it's extremely beautiful and illuminating. But you'd probably enjoy it, particularly because
he was a hero.
Outlining, specifically magazine articles. So it probably relate too strongly. It's really good.
No, he's maybe the best, or certainly one of the best at that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Talk to me a little bit about characters. How do you find yourself? I think you mentioned, Rod, that sometimes a character pops in that you had no idea they were going to be in the book to begin with, and maybe you need them in there of course, you need them for some specific place. Where do you find your inspiration? Either one of you, where do you find your inspiration for characters?
For me, sometimes they literally just pop up, and I'll have in mind a protagonist, a couple of the main characters, especially if you do a sequel, because if you have a character that somebody likes, people tend to like this character of mine called Big Red, who's the ex-mafia dude. And I used him again, and he's a likable kind of character. If this was a film or TV show, he'd probably be played by some look like Tony Soprano kind of a guy. But anyway, later on, as the movement goes forward, and for me, as I develop the story, sometimes I don't know what's going to come next. In a way, I just know I'll get there if I just keep going. And I like to preview as far as I can, but maybe just a name or something will come out of my consciousness. It was somewhere in my memory. I'm assuming this is a memory that's been processed in my head from somebody I already knew a long time ago. And they lend themselves to this character that could maybe influence it, or maybe just be a small character. But that's a good question. Where do your characters come from? And I don't. Somewhere in here.
I think for me, that's why I always enjoy my books so much better than movies. And in fact, most of the time I never see the movie of a book because I've got the character looking and sounding a certain way. I don't want somebody else that I'm for me. So, Will, how about you? Where do you get your characters?
All over, like I said, I read a lot of nonfiction, and anytime I'm reading something where somebody who seems like a really larger than life figure crops up in a book that I'm reading or a newspaper article, like I might file them away and think that's the kind of person who might exist in this landscape. But Rod was talking about how characters can just pop up, and one way that they will often pop up for me is if I'm imagining a scene, and it's like the hero walks into, say, a restaurant, and the first person they talk to is going to be the maitre d'. And the first person you visualize is like a stock, like clip art maitre d', and it's like, well, how can I make this person more interesting? And then as soon as you take that person and you put a twist on them, you give them an affectation or like a tick, or they're already in the middle of something, or they're in a bad mood for some reason, and now suddenly you have like the beginnings of a character. And even if it's just going to be somebody who only appears for one scene, in thinking about them and like trying to make them interesting to yourself, you can flesh them out into a full person. And often that will go to the point where it's like, well, actually, I want to know more about this person, this maitre d' who is threatening to murder the busboy. I want them to come back in the book and find out whether or not he really ended up killing that guy or whatever. And those sorts of like little accidents can be like some of the most fun and vibrant minor or major characters in the book.
Do you find any, what's the difference in imagining characters, say, from the 20s?
Good question.
Now, how do you go about that? Does that work differently in any way, or?
It does. I mean, so because I've written some stuff that's modern day, and for that, I really try to like really think about like the people that I know and like the people that I like see on the street and the people who are around. Not that I actually get to go outside anymore, but back when I used to get to go outside. And with the stuff in the 20s, and particularly because this takes place in kind of a heightened alternate reality, I really do have the privilege of just like any just like totally outrageous figure that I encounter in particularly anything that's like period appropriate nonfiction or fiction, I can just like grab them and like throw them right in there. So it's just like, if this seems like a larger than life, say, historical criminal that I encountered in like reading about 19th century or early 20th century New York, it's like, all right, I'm going to take you, I'm going to reimagine you and like twist you up and like put you in this. And that person will fit well in a way that they wouldn't probably if I tried to put them into something more naturalistic or more period or like, modern day. So I really relish the opportunity to take just like huge personalities and drop them into the story.
Well, folks, we're almost out of time. Hard to believe. This has been a fun conversation, and I want to remind everyone why we're here. Camera here. Hold up your book. But there we go. There's links to these to purchase the book at Parnassus, and by purchasing online through Parnassus, it helps to keep this festival free for all of our festival goers, and hope that next year we'll all be back together again in Nashville. But you know what? This has worked wonderfully. I appreciate so much both of you joining us here today.
Thank you.
Any last comments? I do want to come back and thank our sponsors for this at the very end. Will, Rod, any last comments from you?
Buy Rod's book. It sounds great. Go to Parnassus and buy it.
Yeah, go to Parnassus and buy his too. Get 2 books for the price of 2. And actually, I like Parnassus. They're great, and I've been privileged to be the couple of these, and they're just a wonderful bookseller. But all of them are. So it'd be nice if people just ordered their books from booksellers usually.
Yeah, go anywhere and buy a book. Any book.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm going to hold on to both of my copies so that next year when you're here, I can get you to autograph them.
Really happy to.
Next year, right here at Nashville. Well, thank you all for joining us today on behalf of Humanities Tennessee. And thank you to our key sponsors, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and of course, Parnassus. So again, thank you, Will. Thank you. High fives to everybody.
Bye, guys.
See ya.